In our opinion, the biggest yield limiting factor in the United States today for soybeans is lack of fertility. Well, one of the ways you can put fertilizer on for soybeans is to put it in furrow. But how much can you use? Can you even use any? We want to talk about that today.
Soybean seed is much more sensitive to having salt in the furrow than what corn seed is. You just look at the seed and it makes a lot of sense. Soybeans have this very thin seed coat. Corn is a very hard seed, and you just think just from the seed alone, okay, this probably tolerates salt a lot better. You know, the other thing that I think about with soybeans is we're putting a lot of seed out there compared to what we're putting in corn. Typically, we're putting about 5 times as much soybean seed in the ground, or 5 times as many seeds as we are corn. So you would say, well, wait a second now, I'm putting a lot more seeds out there. Shouldn't it be more safe putting fertilizer there than with the corn? No, it's absolutely not. So we want to be really cautious when we're putting it in furrow. We're not talking about just planting time applications where we're putting it off to the side. In those cases, if you're in a 2x2 or further away from the seed, you've got a big cushion of safety there. But right in the furrow, what can you do?
All right, so here are a couple of our tips. First of all, use water with the fertilizer you're using. If you use water, that kind of dilutes things down. It improves the overall safety. So a lot of times in our operation, we're talking about 1 to 2 gallons worth of fertilizer together with 3 to 4 gallons of water for a total solution of 5 gallons. That really helps. The other big thing is obviously to have a low salt fertilizer, a very low salt fertilizer. Salt is what's going to hurt you, especially if you get into a dry year. And don't get me wrong, I mean, you can get by sometimes with even 5 or maybe 10 gallons of fertilizer in furrow. And I talk to people all the time that say, well, I did this and it worked fine. Yeah, it might work fine 9 out of 10 years, but the problem is that 10th year, and it's usually a dry year, a dry spring that we're talking about, then you're going to see major issues out there. We just don't want you to have that. The last thing we want you to do is invest a bunch of money, and then it costs you money in terms of lost stand or lost yield. So use a low salt fertilizer, put water together with that fertilizer. Generally speaking, you're going to be relatively safe.
When we talk about putting water with the fertilizer, the other part of that is just when we're talking about putting a gallon or maybe 2 gallons of fertilizer total out there per acre, it's really hard to pump that out and get an even flow going down through the furrow. I've seen many farmers over the years that have tried to do this, try to go with lower rates in soybeans than they would in corn. And what ends up happening is it kind of puts a spurt of fertilizer out and then nothing for a little ways, and then another spurt and then nothing. And what we end up with is we're getting more like a 5 to 10 gallon rate for just a small period of time, and then getting a 0 gallon per acre rate out for a ways. And if we can make an even application of that fertilizer, we're less likely to see any injury whatsoever when it's just kind of spurting some fertilizer out there where we get that equivalent of 5 to 10 gallons. A lot of times we will see some injury on those seeds or young seedlings. Again, I like that water recommendation for a number of reasons. One would be just to get an even flow of fertilizer all through that trench.
Okay, here are some other tips for you. Make sure you're checking compatibility first. Sometimes you can put different fertilizers together and they're incompatible, you have settling out. That can definitely end up hurting your stand and hurting your yield. In addition to that, try to keep that fertilizer off the seed if you can. Shoot it over onto the sidewall of the seed trench. Just do anything you can to try to keep it directly off that seed. And finally, I would encourage you, use a balanced blend of fertilizers. So we're talking about micronutrients, phosphorus, potassium, but just make sure you're keeping those rates low. In total, a gallon, maybe 2 gallons of fertilizer per acre. That's about as far as we want to push it, and put that together with some water.
I think it's important to remember that soybeans need a lot of their fertility late in the season, where corn and wheat, they can use fertility earlier in the season and will use a little bit all the way along. With soybeans, they really, once the beans start flowering and putting on pods, that's when they have a very heavy demand for fertilizer. So chances are whatever you're putting on at planting time, you may need to add some more fertilizer later on. And with soybeans, when you can only put just a tiny little bit in furrow, that is just a small portion of your entire fertility program.
So once again, with in-furrow fertilizer in soybeans, this is a practice we've done on our farm for many years. You can certainly do it in your operation too. And when you think about it for just a second, if you've got narrower rows, that means in effect you're spreading that fertilizer out over more rows. So you can get by with a little bit more fertilizer if you chose to do that. Or the other way to look at it is it would be safer to use in-furrow fertilizer in narrower rows. But we just want you to use very low rates, very low salt products, use some water with it, and don't forget soybeans need lots of fertility. We invite you to download the free Ag PhD fertilizer removal app for your smartphone or your iPad and just take a look. Punch in 40 bushel beans or 60 bushel beans, 80 bushel beans, whatever you're shooting for, and just see how much that nutrient removal is. It's a lot bigger than a lot of people think. Soybeans need a lot of fertility. We encourage you to get that out there in a number of different ways to meet your overall crop's needs.
And one last comment on this too. When we look at a lot of fertility programs, guys will say, well, I used corn last year and I used more fertilizer than what the corn really needed, and I'm counting on that carryover fertilizer being left for my soybeans. That is faulty thinking, because our corn yields have come up so much, and typically the fertilizer that we're putting out for corn just barely covers the corn, if even that. We're running drastically short on soybean fertility. As we mentioned earlier, that is the #1 reason that our yields in soybeans have not been higher in our country. And I know many of the universities are looking at this. There's certainly a lot of private research going on. I know our home state, South Dakota State University, is working with farmers across the state. Just put some fertilizer out in a strip across your soybean field, if nothing else, just to prove to yourself that, wow, where I put on some more fertilizer, especially when we look at P and K, we're getting more yield just by putting a little more fertilizer out. There's a lot we can learn about soybean fertility.
Well, lack of fertilizer can absolutely hurt your soybean yields, but so can our weed of the week. Can you identify this week's weed?